Hello, welcome to Context, where we discuss key global and regional stories of today. A series of high-level diplomatic meetings involving the United States, Ukraine and Russia have recently taken place in Saudi Arabia, signaling renewed efforts to explore a possible ceasefire in Ukraine. On the 11th of March, almost 2 weeks ago, US and Ukrainian officials met in Jeddah, where Kyiv agreed to a 30-day ceasefire proposal put forward by Washington, D.C., contingent on Russian acceptance. Following the meeting, the US resumed military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, which had previously been paused, with this resumption being apparently much to the chagrin of the Kremlin, which seems to maintain the view that Kyiv should be deprived of all forms of Western military aid. And now, subsequent to consecutive US-Russia and US-Ukraine talks, at this stage, the central focus is on the latest round of negotiations involving delegations from Moscow and Washington, taking place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The central item on the agenda is claimed to be a halt in long-range attacks against energy facilities and civilian infrastructure in both countries, as well as a pause on assaults in the Black Sea. Meanwhile, despite the diplomatic efforts by the United States, the fighting continues, with both Ukraine and Russia accusing each other of launching overnight drone attacks. Although the discussions on a Black Sea maritime ceasefire to secure commercial shipping routes do not include Ukrainian representatives, they are viewed as a continuation of efforts to assess the feasibility of limited de-escalation measures. Saudi Arabia, positioning itself as a neutral mediator, hosted both sets of talks, trying to reinforce its growing role in international conflict diplomacy. So far, no formal agreement has yet been announced, but the back-to-back engagements reflect a notable increase in US-led diplomatic activity. And joining me now to discuss this very interesting subject is Eric Ham, political analyst out of Washington, and Alexandra Filipenko, joining from Vilnius. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having me.
Good to be here.
Eric, to discuss this subject about these negotiations, we noticed that Americans talk to Ukrainians separately, and Americans also talk to Russians. And the impression given is that some people are saying that although Americans talk to Ukrainians, effectively it's about America and Russia talking to each other. And eventually, the intention here is to make Ukraine agree to what will be agreed between those two parties. What is your view on what's happening now?
Yeah, that's exactly right. But also, I think we cannot underscore the fact that clearly Donald Trump did not get everything he wanted or hoped for in this limited ceasefire. In fact, we know it appears the ceasefire has completely blown up, as we know that Russia and Ukraine have continued to volley attacks back and forth at one another. However, what we continue to hear from President Trump is he believes he's the only one who can actually end the war, because he believes he's the only one who can actually come to an agreement with Vladimir Putin. But I think what we're seeing here is it is Vladimir Putin, not Donald Trump, that is actually not only leading these negotiations, but also it appears to be playing Donald Trump, saying one thing publicly and in these negotiations, but also then doing something completely different or counter after those negotiations continue, after those negotiations end.
Alexandra, the Ukrainian side has been relatively quiet about this round of negotiations that's taking place now, describing them very technical. Are they actually very technical? We know that Kyiv and Moscow, via the US mediation, agreed to a partial ceasefire. Do you think that this, what they call partial ceasefire, its content, its scope will be clarified during the next few days?
Yes, it looks this way, that now it's a technical negotiation. And I must say that on the Russian side, we see the technical team, judging by who is representing Russia. It's Grigory Karasin, head of the Federal Council Committee on International Affairs, not anyone that close to Vladimir Putin, and Sergei Beseda, advisor to the FSB director. And both of them, they professionally, quote unquote, took care of Ukrainian issue. Karasin in the Forest Ministry, Beseda in the FSB, they have the understanding of the situation, and they have this same view on the situation and on Ukraine, that Ukraine must be part of Russia or must be heavily influenced by Russia. They have been very open about it. And I must say that Beseda is the one from the FSB. He is the one who is the author of the phrase Kiev in 3 days, that Russia will take Kiev in 3 days. So these are not high-ranking officials. Of course, generally they are high-ranking officials, but for this kind of negotiation, they are not that high-ranking. This leads me to think that this is a rather technical negotiation, that the solutions are going to be taken actually in Moscow, and they will only transfer the information.
Eric, it seems that both Russia and Ukraine, for very understandable reasons, must be interested in the restoration of the Black Sea grain initiative. Probably Ukraine would be able to export grain from its ports without being attacked, whereas Russia would export from farm produce and fertilizers through the Black Sea, getting some form of relief from sanctions imposed by Western actors. What is the role of this particular element in the current negotiations, you think?
Well, I think it's clear that Russia is getting everything it wants, and we know that President Trump is making clear that he's prepared to give over so much to Russia without actually even asking for anything in return. And in fact, we know that President Trump has made clear that before anything is actually to move in terms of the United States, which has not even provided security guarantees and it does not appear to be willing to do so. We know much of what happens in these negotiations is contingent on President Trump actually getting this minerals agreement with Ukraine. And so I think what we're seeing here is that both of these leaders, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, certainly have their own agendas, and clearly it appears as though Ukraine is on the outside looking in, as they're certainly going to have to pay a very hefty and heavy price. And right now, I think what we're seeing here is President Zelensky is actually being squeezed by two very powerful forces, and I think it underscores just how feckless Europe is right now, as it simply has not been able to offer anything in return, even as we know that President Macron as well as Prime Minister Keir Starmer are both planning a Ukrainian summit. But again, they have yet to actually provide any concrete details in terms of what they're prepared to offer that will not only shape what's happening on the battlefield, but somehow make or push Vladimir Putin to recognize that it might be in his best interest to give up more, because right now what we're seeing is no one is actually providing Ukraine any of the resources and help that they need to actually put them in a much better negotiation position.
Alexandra, I earlier asked Eric about his view on the assessment made by some analysts that it looks like these two tracks of negotiations look like US and Russia talking to each other, and they want to agree on something, and then later this agreement which will be imposed on Ukraine, and he sort of agreed that this assessment has got certain degree of reality. But Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in a blistering attack on Putin, criticized him for lying about the real situation on the battlefield and in terms of casualties. He said that the state of Russian economy is very bad, and that Russia has been damaged by Putin's foolish imperial ambition. That's what President Zelensky said. But Ukraine's own predicament is also need to be taken into account. How badly Ukraine itself, as a nation at this current juncture, needs ceasefire. We understand that Russia may have some problems, but on the battlefield, at this juncture, Ukraine is not winning. That's, I think, clear to everybody.
Yes, and as we speak, I see the information that just now a new rocket attack from the Russian side on the city of Sumy, 65 people, at least 65 people injured, 14 of them are children, and no report on who has died. But we see those attacks are going on, and they're intensifying, I must say, on the Russian side. Starting from the Putin-Trump call, the attacks seem to be intensifying, and Russia can wait. Russia can drag the time. It has this opportunity. while for Ukraine, every day counts, every hour counts, and really the situation on the ground is dire. Although President Trump has said that Ukrainians, a group of Ukrainian soldiers was encircled by a Russian army in Kursk region, this is not that much correct. But the situation in the Kursk region is really difficult for the Ukrainian forces. They basically hold no ground there anymore, just a little bit of ground there in comparison to what they have just a few months ago. And throughout the front, the situation is very, very difficult for Ukraine and for Ukrainians as a whole. Of course, it's impossible to talk on behalf of all Ukrainians if they are ready for a ceasefire without any promise of an actual peace deal, without any promise of actual future security guarantees. But we understand that for Ukraine, the situation is extremely difficult because there are not enough people and not enough ammunition. So, of course, if Europe steps up right now, then the situation can be turned around. But as of now, on the ground, of course, for Ukraine, it is very, very difficult to continue fighting and to continue trying to get back its occupied territory.
And now the last round of questions from me. Eric, Zelensky has emphasized a couple of times that he's open to Trump's proposal related to a full 30-day ceasefire. And Vladimir Putin, Russian president, made it absolutely clear that complete ceasefire is contingent on a halt of arms supplies to Kyiv and suspension of Ukraine's military mobilization. And this demand has been rejected by Ukraine and its allies. So for the purpose of complete ceasefire, what should happen? You earlier mentioned that Vladimir Putin is really getting what he needs to get, and Trump has not been so successful in terms of forcing him into quick ceasefire. What else will need to happen for complete ceasefire to be established?
Well, I think we have to be very clear and transparent about one thing. Quite frankly, President Trump simply isn't equipped to actually engage in these negotiations because he simply doesn't have the wherewithal to actually move Vladimir Putin because he continues to give him everything. And so there's no incentive for Vladimir Putin to be an actual honest broker in these negotiations. At least under President Biden, we saw not only sanctions, but we also saw continued enormous military support to Ukraine. And that was certainly would have continued had a Democrat stayed in office. But we know that even with President Trump, he's been looking at actually lifting sanctions on Russia, bringing Russia back into the G7. So right now, there just isn't any pushback. And so I think what we're seeing right now is Donald Trump, even though America does hold enormous cards, not only has he given them all away, but he just shows himself to be very weak and ineffective in actually being able to deal with someone as wily and sophisticated as Vladimir Putin.
And Alexander, how do you find President Trump's efforts to bring about a permanent ceasefire?
Well, I would absolutely agree that the cards of President Trump are rather weak right now, especially since Moscow knows that he wants a ceasefire as fast as possible. So that is why they're dragging their feet, and that's why they are going to continue to do that. There is no clarity, absolutely no clarity on if Moscow really wants a ceasefire. Everything shows that actually they do not want it, although the American delegation is saying otherwise. But if there would be some progress, there might be a progress on the ceasefire in the Black Sea, on ships, on the sea in general, and this might move to the full ceasefire. But I'm afraid that we're talking about weeks and weeks of negotiations, and Russia will be happy to drag its feet.
Well, thank you very much indeed to both of you. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is for Alexander Filipenko, joined from Vilnius, and Eric Ham, analyst from Washington, D.C. Well, as diplomatic channels reopen in the Gulf, the path to peace remains somewhat uncertain, but not closed, of course. With Jeddah and Riyadh now hosting key talks, global eyes are fixed on whether dialogue can do what force has not. bring silence to the guns, even if only for 30 days. I'm Orkhan Amashov, and see you very soon.